Okay, so today's lecture is Andrew Jackson. I'll do about half of this lecture today and half on Wednesday. And as some of you have heard, Andrew Jackson was arguably the most controversial U.S. president of all. He was the Donald Trump before Donald Trump existed. In fact, Trump was nothing compared to the controversy that Andrew Jackson was. And you'll see a little bit about why. There are various reasons why. Some of them not really having anything to do with his policies, just his character and his personality. So Jackson was born in 1767, and you hardly ever hear it commented upon, but even his ancestry and his childhood and his upbringing were a little bit of a factor in his controversy later in life. He was born in the Waxhaws region in South Carolina, right on the border with North Carolina. He was born to Scots-Irish colonists, and that's what I suggested was a little bit different. The earlier generation of American presidents, American leaders were of English ancestry. Jefferson, Washington, Adams, all of them. The Scots-Irish were different. And a lot of Southerners, white Southerners of Scots-Irish descent, they were famous for being quarrelsome, was a nice way to put it. They were Indian fighters. They had a very kind of rough upbringing and or culture, you might say. And Jackson epitomized all of that. So one important thing about him, though, in terms of his personal biography, he was born just 3 weeks after his father died in a logging accident. So he never met his father. And then another very formative event in his life, he was still a boy when the American Revolution began. His eldest brother died after fighting in the Battle of Stono Ferry in 1779. And then Andrew and another brother, Robert, became couriers or mail carriers for the American Army, for the Patriots. They were captured by the British in 1781. And this famous lithograph, I think it is, or drawing, shows a famous scene after he was captured. A British soldier, a British officer, ordered Jackson to shine his boots, and Andrew told him something unprintable about what he could do with his boots. And so the officer drew his sword and struck him with the side of it in his face. Not the edge to kill him, but the flat part of it to use it as a kind of as a like a club. And Jackson raised his hand to dodge to ward off the blow, and it left a scar where it hit his arm and where it hit his face. He had the scar for the rest of his life, and that kind of symbolized also the fact that he hated the British for the rest of his life. He just had a profound hatred of them. And the officer hit his brother too. His brother Robert was just as stubborn as he was and refused to shine the officer's boots. Then they were kept prisoner for a little while longer. I don't remember exactly how long. They both contracted smallpox and nearly starved to death while they were prisoners, but they were eventually released. It was his mother, I think, who was able to arrange for his and his brother's release. But the conditions that they had been kept in were so poor that his brother died just a couple of days after they returned home, just from the starvation and the disease and the toll that had taken on his health. And then his mother volunteered to serve as a nurse on ships in the Charleston harbor that were used as floating prisoner of war camps. They kept the American prisoners there. These ships were notorious for the inhumane treatment of the prisoners. During the American Revolution, I don't think I mentioned this, but there was a signee of the Declaration of Independence who was kept on board one of these ships in the New York harbor, I think, and he never recovered his health because of the disease, the starvation, just the horrible conditions they were kept in. So his mother volunteered to serve as a nurse. There was a cholera outbreak on board of the ship. She contracted cholera and died. And so with his older brother dead, his brother Robert dead, his mom dead, his father had died obviously 14 years earlier. By the end of the American Revolution, Jackson was a 14-year-old orphan. He moved when the war ended to North Carolina, and he studied law there. And in 1787, he was admitted to the bar in North Carolina. And here you see an old picture. This picture looks like it's from the 1800s of a house that he boarded in while he was studying law as a teenager in North Carolina. He would have been about 17 or so when he began the study. And he would have been about 20 when he passed the bar and became a lawyer in North Carolina. A little bit after that, he moved to Nashville. So he would have been about 21, I think, at the time he moved to Nashville. And Nashville was a small town on the frontier. Tennessee wasn't even a state yet. He met a woman named Rachel Donaldson Robards, pictured here. And this love affair marriage would cause heartache for the rest of his and his wife's life. She was already married. She was married to a guy named Lewis Robards, and apparently he was an awful husband, and they were separated at the time that she met Jackson, and eventually they got divorced. But the controversy is that Jackson and Rachel got married before she and her other husband got divorced, and they told everybody they were husband and wife, and acted as if they were husband and wife. And so technically, because the second marriage preceded the divorce, they were bigamous. And after the divorce became final, they remarried in something like 1794 to make it official, to make it good that the second marriage was now valid. But for some people, this was a scandal that he and she had been shacking up before the divorce was final. Today, I guess people wouldn't even notice, but back then there were lots of people who took that sort of thing very seriously. And she was very sensitive about it. She was very sensitive about criticism of being with Jackson before her divorce was final with her first husband. And he was very sensitive about criticism of her, because the criticism was always directed at the woman anyway. So that story of the kind of unorthodox marriage between Andrew and Rachel and the circumstances surrounding it led to one of the most infamous events of Jackson's life. In 1806, so Jackson would have been about 39, I guess. He was by now a very successful lawyer and politician in Tennessee, but rumors about the circumstances of his marriage to Rachel continued, persisted, and a newspaper editor, I think, named Charles Dickinson, published a criticism of Jackson, basically calling Rachel a bigamist, someone who cheated on her first husband, technically, since they weren't divorced when she shacked up with Jackson. Jackson was so offended by the criticism that he challenged Charles Dickinson to a duel. I don't know how many duels Jackson had over the course of his life. I can't remember. But I do remember someone said he had so many bullets inside of him he rattled when he walked, which is probably not quite true, but that kind of summed up the idea people had about Jackson. But the duel with Dickinson is famous because Dickinson was well known to be an excellent dueler and to be a very good shot, an expert marksman. And so Jackson came up with a strategy for winning this duel that might sound suicidal to you. He decided that he would deliberately let Dickinson shoot first. And his hope was Dickinson would rush the shot, thinking that Jackson was going to try to shoot first as well. And in rushing the shot, he would aim poorly and miss. And then Jackson could take his time and calmly shoot Dickinson. Kind of like what may have happened with Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Well, the strategy sort of backfired. Dickinson did shoot first. He did not miss. The shot lodged like that far from Jackson's heart, and the bullet was so close to his heart that they just left it there for the rest of his life. They figured he was in more danger of an operation to try to remove it than to just leave it where it was. Jackson was shot in the chest, Blood was pouring out of his chest, but he didn't fall down. He carefully aimed his shot. Dickinson remained perfectly still by the code, the etiquette of the day. You weren't supposed to run away. You weren't supposed to try to deflect the shot in any way. And so Jackson shot him through the heart and killed him. And this story, among others about Jackson's dueling, led people to have totally different ideas about him. Half the people in the country, like the old-fashioned guys, the Thomas Jefferson, John Adams and his son, and that kind of group, they thought Jackson was just a barbarian who went around killing people. People from the frontier who were used to duels and used to sort of this thing thought Jackson was just awesome because, you know, of the way that whole duel unfolded. So, yeah. There was another story, I'll just go ahead and tell it. One guy tried to shoot Jackson when he was president, and this was the first assassination attempt on a sitting president, a president who was still in office. He fired, and the gun backfired and didn't shoot Jackson, and Jackson grabbed his cane and just started beating the man, and they had to grab Jackson and pull him off, or he would have beaten him to death with his cane. And he was about 70 years old at that time. So, interesting character. So he became, I told you he had a thriving political career and legal career in Tennessee. He became Attorney General of Tennessee in 1791. He would have been very young, 24 years old or so. So right off the bat, he starts his political career. He was elected to the Tennessee Constitutional Convention in 1796 when it was ready to become a state. And then when it did become a state, he became its first U.S. representative to Congress. In Congress, he opposed George Washington. Jackson was a Jeffersonian Republican, and remember, Washington was a Federalist. So he opposed the Jay Treaty and other Washington policies. He then became a U.S. Senator, but he hated being a U.S. Senator and just resigned the following year and went back to Tennessee. I think he hated serving in Congress, period. So he returned to Tennessee. He got a spot as a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court, where he earned an excellent reputation for his decisions. And then he resigned that job in 1804. He became a planter and opened a general store, which is kind of like a market, sort of, food, clothing, all sorts of things. That's why they called it a general store. He bought a plantation called the Hermitage, which is still in existence near Nashville. You can go visit it and study his life and that sort of thing. Eventually, that plantation was over 1,000 acres in size, and its principal crop was cotton. Now, the primary workforce on the plantation, not surprisingly, was slaves. He started with 9 slaves and eventually had about 150. And over the course of his lifetime, he probably owned about 300 different slaves from one time or another. His slaves live in cabins, about 400 square feet, lived in groups of 5 to 10 people. One thing that might surprise you, but actually doesn't strike me as very uncommon, he supplied the slaves with guns and knives so that they could provide their own food through fishing and hunting. He paid them with money and coins sometimes for their work so that they could go shop for food and clothing in local markets. But that doesn't mean he was nice. Obviously, they were slaves, so they were kept in captivity against their will. They were whipped if they disobeyed or if they tried to escape. If they did try to escape, he offered rewards for their capture. This is an example of a reward, offering $50 for the capture of a man about 30 years old who had tried to escape. And it even offers $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him to the amount of 300. So he's authorizing someone to whip him if they catch him, basically. So the slavery on Jackson's plantation was brutal, like it was everywhere else. Now, Jackson goes from being a frontier duelist and politician and plantation owner to a national hero as a result of the War of 1812. So I want to talk about that for a minute. There were different causes of the war. One cause was that Britain was at war with France, with Napoleon, and the war was it was almost a world war. It involved the whole European continent, and countries in the middle, like the United States, got involved in the war, kind of against their will. So Britain seized American ships during this war, if it suspected that they were trading with the French, and it impressed, American sailors. And I've used that term before. Impress meant they literally stopped an American ship at sea, boarded the ship, and rounded up whoever they could accuse of deserting from the British Navy and took them by force to the British ship and made them serve on that ship. And they did this basically because they were lacking manpower. And this was a way for them to kidnap Americans, is how our side saw it, and force them to work on their ships against their will. And all of that infuriated Americans. It outraged Americans. Another thing that was going on that was a cause of the war is that Americans believed, rightly, that the British in Canada were arming Indians, also the British in Florida, and inciting them to raid American settlements. And this little picture here gives you a good idea of what Americans thought was happening, because it really was, and how they were outraged by it. So you see a British officer taking the scalp, and this is the American who's been killed and scalped, and they're handing the bloody scalp to the British officer, and it doesn't show the payment, but it's understood that the officer is giving them the weapons that they use and other rewards as well to encourage them. So the British were using the Indians to make war by proxy, right, against the United States. And this infuriated Americans, of course. Another issue that led to the War of 1812 was that there were American ambitions to annex Canada and Florida, or at least a part of Canada. I'll show you the part that they had their eye on. There was a sense, for one thing, that the only way to stop the British from arming Indians and using them to attack Americans was to take the territory away from the British. And then we could have our own law and our own policies there, and that would end what was going on. There was another sense that turned out to be overly optimistic and just flat wrong. There were a lot of American settlers, people who had moved from the United States to a part of Canada, and there was a sense among some Americans that those people would be pro-American and would jump at the chance to be annexed by the United States, and that turned out not to be true. I want to talk a little bit about these Indian attacks and give you a little bit of backstory here. Especially in the Northwest, there had been a war going on with Indians for several years, and this kind of led directly into the War of 1812. And what was going on, there were Americans who were moving into Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin, those Northwest states near the border with Canada, and there were Indians who were fighting back and trying to kick the Americans out of those territories and assert Indian dominance. They were led by two brothers, Shawnee leaders, Tecumseh, who is pictured on the right, and Tenskwatawa, who is pictured on the left. And Tenskwatawa is sometimes called the Prophet. That was his nickname. These Shawnee leaders did a really amazing thing for the late 1790s, early 1800s. They organized a pan-Indian alliance against the Americans. This may have been the first time that an Indian leader encouraged Indians to think of themselves as Indians. And what I mean by that is, for most of the history of Europeans versus Indians, the United States versus Indians, they didn't think of themselves as Indians. We thought of them as Indians. They thought of themselves as Shawnee, Cherokee, Comanche, Sioux. They were a tribal identity. And they were often worse enemies with other Indians than they ever were with the Americans. And let me give you more information about that. In every war that I know of that was fought in what's now the United States, between either the English colonists and Indians or the Americans and Indians, in every single war that I can think of, it was actually the Americans plus some Indians against other Indians, right? So there was already a feud going on between Indians, and we were just on one side of it or the other. But these guys had a novel idea. They encouraged other Indian tribes in the Northwest and the Mississippi River Valley, and even down into what's now the southern states, to think of themselves as Indians, as having something in common, greater than their tribal affiliation, and to see Americans as the common enemy who were expanding westward and threatening to take their land. And they were very successful. Tecumseh was the military leader, the guy on the right. He was the genius of military organization and the political alliance. He traveled constantly up and down the Mississippi River, forging alliances with other tribes. His brother, Tenskwatawa, was more of a mystical leader. That's why they called him the prophet. And disaster for their alliance happened in 1811. Tecumseh was off on one of his trips, his kind of political missions, meeting with other Indians, working on the alliances. And if I remember correctly, he gave his brother, there were American soldiers nearby this is in Indiana, under the leadership of William Henry Harrison. And Tecumseh told his brother, no matter what you do while I'm away, don't attack William Henry Harrison, right? Just stay put, wait till I get back. Well, Tenskwatawa had a vision. And the vision told him that if they attacked the Americans, that the Americans' bullets would bounce off them harmlessly. And this vision happens 2 or 3 times in the history of Indian conflicts with Americans, and it always ends very badly for the Indians. Because they listened to this vision, they attacked William Henry Harrison, the bullets did not bounce off of them, and William Henry Harrison defeated the prophet at something called the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. This was a devastating defeat for the Shawnee Indians and their allies. They never recovered from it, and they were never able to threaten the United States in the northwestern part of the United States again. They were still there, and you'll see Tecumseh in the War of 1812, but they were not as much of a threat, not in what's now the United States territory. So I mentioned American annexation ambitions. This is the part of Canada that I was talking about. The part that is on the other side of the Great Lakes from Ohio and Michigan. There were lots of people there who were from American states originally, like New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. And so some Americans, Jefferson, said that conquering this part of Canada would be a mere matter of marching, that there wouldn't even be a fight. The Americans would show up and they would just cheer, hooray, we're Americans now, and there wouldn't even be a battle. And he was completely wrong. They were loyal to their new country of Canada, and they fought very fiercely. So there were groups in Congress called war hawks. And the war hawks, the 2 of them that are most famous, the only 2 you have to remember, are Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. Clay was from Kentucky, and Calhoun was from South Carolina. They were young congressmen. They were pro-war, and they wanted war for all the reasons I've listed so far, and they were very ambitious and open about the U.S. taking Upper Canada and annexing it, and maybe taking Florida and annexing it as well. So war was declared on June 1st, 1812, and I want to just talk about some of the major events of the war, just a few, so you have a little bit of an idea of what transpired. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just a few minutes. So war is declared on June 1st, 1812. And one of the first interesting things that happened was a naval victory. In August of 1812, a U.S. ship called the Constitution defeated a British ship called the Guerriere, which is French for warrior. And the French ship's cannonballs, the British ship's cannonballs, bounced off of the Constitution's hull harmlessly, leading the Americans to nickname the ship Old Ironsides. There was a poem written about Old Ironsides in the 1800s. And I should point out, you can see in this picture here on the left that this is a ship that still exists. You can visit it today. It's in the harbor in Boston. It is a commissioned U.S. naval ship. So if you go to visit it, you can actually get a tour by someone in the Navy who will show you around the ship and tell you the history of it. And if you ever get to do that, I highly advise you to do so. It's a fascinating tour. And one of the things he will tell you, you'll get to go inside and you'll get to see the deck where these cannons are. And you can see how they're facing out. And you'll be glad that you were not born in the 1800s and were not in the United States Navy or any Navy anywhere in the world. Because I can imagine a more miserable existence, but it still ranks up there as one of the worst you can imagine. And because when I did this 25, 30 years ago, he told us what it was like to serve in battle. First of all, you had to be short. If you were over like 5'6" or so, you might not qualify because the decks were so small. They needed short people just to get around well. Second of all, there was a fairly good chance that by the end of the battle you would be deaf and or maimed because they had these cannons tied down with thick ropes like this. But even as thick as these ropes were, it wasn't uncommon for the cannons to just burst the rope to snap, and then the cannon would go bouncing around inside the hull, crushing any guy who got in its way. So guys would get arms and legs broken and mangled from time to time during these battles. And even if you didn't get physically mangled by a rampaging cannon, think about hearing these cannon fire over and over again for hours and hours. That's where I said you might end up deaf at the end of it, just from the roar in your ears, the constant roar. So it was a pretty tough life. So this next photo too, I want to tell you about it before I forget. The Constitution was so successful in its first few battles that the British sent out an order to their fleet never to take on the Constitution one-on-one, but to only do so if they had it, at a disadvantage of like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 to 1, because it was just that good of a ship. But they did have a chance to catch it right after it first put to sea. And this painting memorializes that. The Constitution was put to sea, I think, just off the shore of Rhode Island. And a British fleet almost immediately spotted it and was about to overtake it. You can see the Constitution right here and several British ships behind it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think 6 or so. And then the wind died. And so the Constitution was in the ocean. All the other ships were behind it in the ocean. There was no wind blowing, so they weren't moving anywhere. And the American captain got the idea to set all the rowboats in the water, tie them to the Constitution, and then row away, pulling the Constitution behind. And the British ships tried to do the same thing. So what you had was a slow motion chase of the Americans tugging the Constitution away and the British trying to tug after it, and the Americans won and the Constitution was not captured. It survived. So I thought that was an interesting story. So another important story is the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. There was a major battle in, I think this was in Alabama. It was between Andrew Jackson, who was the general in charge of the American militia. The militia that he organized and led during this battle was, I think, almost entirely composed of volunteers from Tennessee, including some people who would go on to be very famous. David Crockett. He never called himself Davy. David Crockett was there. Sam Houston was there, and apparently got shot in the groin with an arrow, and the wound agonized him for the rest of his life. The Americans won the battle and crushed the Creek Indians, and they were also helped by Cherokee allies. Like I said, there was never a battle between Americans and Indians. The Cherokees and the Creeks were enemies. The Cherokees fought alongside Jackson at Horseshoe Bend. This battle is important historically because the Creeks were defeated and they were forced to sign a treaty with Jackson afterwards, giving up their rights to much of what's Alabama and Mississippi today. And they moved westward after that, or at least they were forced to. Another memorable event during the war, the British captured and burned Washington, D.C. They burned the U.S. Capitol and the White House. You've probably all heard the story of James Madison fleeing and his wife Dolly Madison saving the giant portrait of George Washington just before the British arrived. Apparently, when the British got to the White House and burned it, the Americans had fled just a few minutes before, and there was a meal set on the president's table ready for him to eat before he was told he had to flee, and the British officer sat down and ate the president's meal before they burned the building. Another interesting and memorable event is the story of the events that led up to the composition of the Star-Spangled Banner. I like to tell this story because many of you have probably mumbled the words to the banner without having any idea what the story is, why it was written, or what it means. The story goes like this. So the British wanted to attack Fort McHenry, which was a few miles outside of, it protected the harbor that led to Baltimore. And so the strategic importance of this is if they could conquer Fort McHenry, then they would have easy access to Baltimore, and they could now sack and burn Baltimore like they had just done Washington, D.C. a little while earlier. Well, an American named Francis Scott Key got word that a friend of his had been captured by the British. He boarded the British ships in the harbor just before the battle started to ask them basically to let his friend go. I don't remember the details. His friend wasn't a combatant, obviously, I guess. And so Key got there. He met the guy who was in charge of the British fleet here. And the British guy said, okay, sure, we'll let your friend go, no problem. But we're about to start bombing Fort McHenry. You have to wait until the battle's over, and then we'll put you ashore and you can leave. So the story, the song, the poem, tells the story of Key watching this battle from the British point of view. He's on board one of their ships. He sees them bombing the fort all night long. And obviously it's dark. There's no electricity, no lights in those days. The only light he can see by is the bombs bursting in the air. And whenever the bombs burst, he can see the American flag. And he knows that that means the fort hasn't surrendered. So, and then the famous lines, in the morning, he's waiting for the sun to rise, and he can see for himself, is the flag still there? Has the fort surrendered, or is the fort still fighting? And obviously, the fort didn't surrender, it didn't fight, and the song is celebrating. It didn't give up, and that's what the song is celebrating. So, that's what these lines are talking about. Who's brought, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. And this is the flag. It's a real flag. You can see it. I think it's at the Smithsonian in Washington, if I remember correctly. I think I saw it there about 30 years or so ago. Okay, now another interesting event connected to the War of 1812. By the end of the war, it was really kind of a stalemate. The British had burned Washington, and the American invasion, the Americans had tried to invade Canada actually, and it failed miserably. But neither side really thought they had anything to gain from continuing to fight. So they had a meeting in Europe to discuss a peace treaty. Well, while that meeting was going on, Federalists met in Hartford, Rhode Island at the Hartford Convention. And on December the 15th, they came up with some ideas or proposals of their own. They wanted to amend the Constitution to make a war like this one unlikely to happen again. See, Federalists were opposed to this war from the beginning. Madison, remember, was a Republican, like Jefferson. The Federalists in New England thought this war was just economic folly. Right? Their primary trading partner was England. They were hurt by the British stopping American ships, but they were hurt a lot more by not having any trade at all with England and being at war with England. So the Federalists were opposed to the war, and they wanted to do some of the following things. They wanted to end the 3/5 clause. If you remember, the 3/5 clause said that a state like South Carolina, for example, which was basically half free, meaning mostly white, and half black, mostly slave, but not all, like 80%, 90% slave. Let me rephrase this. When it came time, some black there, when it came time to calculate how many votes they got in the Electoral College, and when it came time to calculate how many seats they got in the House of Representatives, they would get credit for every free person that lived there, but also for 3/5 of every slave, right? So if there are 100 slaves and 100 free people, then you get 133. Wait, no, 160. Sorry, my math failed me for a second. The Federalists wanted to end the 3/5 clause and say you didn't get any credit at all, zero, for whatever percentage of your population was enslaved. That means they would get fewer votes in the Electoral College and fewer seats in the House of Representatives. Why did the Federalists care so much about this? Well, slavery was gone virtually in all of the northern states. There were no slaves anymore, hardly any. And there were a tiny few, but hardly any. In New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, what would become Maine, and so on. And if you didn't give the southern states credit in the Electoral College and the House for their slave population, they wouldn't have been winning these presidential elections. Right? Jefferson would have lost to Adams. I think Madison would have lost to whoever challenged him back in 1809. And so they figured we would have the presidency and we wouldn't be involved in these foolish kinds of wars. They also wanted to have a one-term limit for presidents, and they wanted to have a constitutional requirement that you needed a 2/3 majority vote in Congress to declare war. So all of these constitutional changes they wanted were aimed at preventing the recurrence of a war like this War of 1812. Well, some people in the Federalist Party also talked about secession. Remember, Aaron Burr and his group, the Essex Junto, in the early 1800s, had talked about that as well. They wanted the Northeast to actually secede from the country. That's how disgusted they were by the War of 1812. Well, when rumor got out that there was talk of secession going on amongst the Federalists at this Hartford Convention, that destroyed the reputation of the party, and it virtually ceased to exist after this. So the Treaty of Ghent was signed just a few days later, December 24. The important thing to remember is that it settled none of the issues before the war. The harassment of U.S. ships at sea, the impressment of U.S. sailors at sea, the arming of Indians. Britain didn't agree to stop any of that or apologize for any of it. The two sides basically just agreed to stop fighting because they didn't want to fight anymore. And all territory would revert to what it had been originally. So America wouldn't get any new territory in Canada or Florida, and the British wouldn't claim any new territory in the United States either. Now, that treaty was signed on December 24. But it took several weeks for the treaty to get to the United States because travel by ship was slow. It took, I think, 6 weeks or so, 4 to 6 weeks, for word of the treaty to get from there to across the Atlantic Ocean. And here's one of the great ironies. One of the biggest battles of the war, and by far the biggest American victory, was fought after the treaty had been signed to end the war, but before anyone in America had heard about it. That's the Battle of New Orleans. I didn't write down the exact date, and I can't remember the exact date, but it was in January of 1815. So it was about 2 weeks after they signed the treaty. And there was a British army that was put ashore just a few miles from New Orleans. Andrew Jackson organized the American defenses in New Orleans, and it was an unusual army that he organized. It included free blacks in New Orleans. It included Indians, his Cherokee allies and other Indians. It included pirates. There was a pirate who was famous in Galveston, Jean Lafitte, a French pirate. He helped the Americans. I don't remember why. He cut a deal with Jackson, I guess. And so they organized their defenses. The Americans are on the left of this painting that you can see here. The British are on the right. The British had a remarkably brave but foolish strategy, which is, let's line up in straight rows and march at the Americans and hope we all get to them before they shoot us to pieces and die. The strategy worked beautifully for the Americans. The British marched in straight lines towards the American defensive position. The Americans tore apart the British with artillery fire and rifle fire. And when the battle was over, about 2,000 British soldiers were dead or wounded, and I think maybe half a dozen Americans were injured in the fighting, probably from incidental things like gunpowder explosions and stuff like that. So it was a huge, one-sided, lopsided victory for the Americans. And this made Andrew Jackson a national hero and eventually president of the United States. From now on, he was the guy who killed people in duels and who whipped the British at New Orleans. And he could live off that for the rest of his life. Another important factor, this battle led to a huge burst in American confidence after being humiliated with Washington burning and losing in other parts of the country, to have finally, in the last battle of the war, to have thoroughly and completely whipped the British Army, made the Americans feel like we won the war. Even if the treaty on paper said it was basically a tie, they felt like they won, like they had successfully defended themselves and defeated the British. So those were two results of the war. Jackson is a national hero. American nationalism gets a boost from the victory at New Orleans, also from the victory at Fort McHenry, which leads to the Star-Spangled Banner, and the victories of the U.S.S. Constitution at sea. Another couple of things I want to mention. I said this already, but it's important. The Federalist Party just disintegrated. And last, during the war, American industry grew because we were cut off for 2 or 3 years from trade with Britain, and Britain was our biggest trading partner going into the war. And so Americans had to start producing their own everything, muskets and clothes and rifles and that sort of thing. And so that was a boost to American industry. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll continue with the election of 1824 tomorrow.